The moving truck pulled up to the beautiful colonial house on Oak Street just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of this upscale suburban neighborhood. The new homeowner stepped out of his car, taking in the sight of his dream home with pride gleaming in his eyes. At 45 years old, after 2 decades of dedicated service in law enforcement, he had finally achieved one of his biggest life goals. As he began directing the movers, a curtain twitched in the house next door. Mrs. Henderson, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, peered out with narrowed eyes at the activity. She had lived on Oak Street for 30 years and prided herself on knowing everything about everyone. This unexpected arrival disturbed her usual routine of monitoring the neighborhood from her perfectly positioned window seat. "I don't remember any houses being sold on this street," she muttered to herself, reaching for her phone to text the neighborhood watch group she had created years ago. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she detailed her concerns about suspicious activity at number 42. The new homeowner, meanwhile, was completely absorbed in the task of moving in. He had spent years saving for this house, carefully choosing this neighborhood for its excellent schools and safe environment. As a law enforcement officer, he knew the importance of community, and he was looking forward to becoming part of this one. As the movers carried in his furniture, he noticed a few neighbors peeking out their windows, but no one came to welcome him. He wasn't surprised, it was getting late, after all. He'd make proper introductions tomorrow, maybe even bring some cookies to break the ice. His mother had always taught him that kindness was the best way to build bridges. Mrs. Henderson, however, had other plans. After sending several increasingly worried messages to the neighborhood watch group, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She dialed 911, her voice trembling with manufactured concern. "Yes, there's suspicious activity at 42 Oak Street," she reported, watching as more boxes were carried inside. "There's a man I've never seen before, and he's moving things into the Thompsons' old house. I know for a fact they didn't sell it, there wasn't even a for sale sign. Something's not right here." The dispatcher tried to reassure her that this might be a legitimate move-in, but Mrs. Henderson insisted. No, you don't understand. This neighborhood, well, we have certain standards. This man doesn't seem to fit in. Please send someone quickly." What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that her call had been routed to the very department her new neighbor now headed. The dispatcher, recognizing the address, had to suppress a smile as she professionally handled the call. Following protocol, she dispatched a patrol car to the scene, knowing full well what was about to unfold. As the new homeowner finished thanking the movers and began unpacking his first box in the kitchen, he heard the familiar sound of a police cruiser pulling up outside. He smiled to himself, wondering if his colleagues had come to welcome him to the neighborhood. But when he glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Henderson standing on her porch, arms crossed and a triumphant expression on her face, he understood exactly what was happening. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders and walked to the door. He had dealt with similar situations throughout his career, but this time was different. This was his home, his sanctuary. As he opened the door, the young officer approaching his porch stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in recognition. The new homeowner stepped onto his porch, the porch light illuminating his face and the confident smile he wore. Mrs. Henderson's expression began to shift as she watched the young officer snap to attention and say, "Good evening, Chief. We received a call about suspicious activity at this address. I guess the caller wasn't aware that you were moving in today." The word "Chief" echoed across the quiet street, carrying clearly to where Mrs. Henderson stood frozen on her porch. Her face drained of color as the reality of her actions began to sink in. She had just called the police on her new neighbor, the new chief of police. The chief's response was calm and measured, years of experience evident in his handling of the situation. "Thank you for responding so promptly, Officer Chen. It's good to see the department is staying vigilant." He turned to face Mrs. Henderson, who was now trying to quietly retreat into her house. "Would you like to join us, neighbor?" I was just about to unpack my coffee maker, and I'd love to discuss how we can work together to keep our neighborhood safe, for everyone." Mrs. Henderson stood frozen on her porch, her hand clutching her collar as the implications of her actions crashed over her like a cold wave. The chief's invitation hung in the air, both gracious and subtly challenging. After several long moments, she managed to find her voice. I should really get inside. It's getting late," she stammered, turning toward her door. But the chief's next words stopped her in her tracks. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, since you're so invested in neighborhood security, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some community outreach programs I'm planning to implement. Your experience with the Neighborhood Watch could be valuable." Officer Chen watched the exchange with barely concealed admiration. The chief's approach was masterful, taking a potentially volatile situation and turning it into an opportunity for community building. This was exactly why he had risen through the ranks so quickly. Reluctantly, Mrs. Henderson found herself walking across her lawn to join them. The chief had already pulled out 3 camping chairs from his moving boxes and was setting them up on his porch. The casual domesticity of the scene made her previous accusations seem even more ridiculous. "I just made a fresh pot of coffee," the chief said, disappearing inside briefly. Through the open door, Mrs. Henderson could see moving boxes labeled with ordinary things like kitchen and books. Family photos waited to be hung, and a child's basketball lay in the corner. The normalcy of it all made her stomach twist with shame. When the chief returned with 3 steaming mugs, Officer Chen had already started sharing stories about the department's recent successful community initiatives. The chief listened intently, occasionally adding his own insights about programs he'd implemented in his previous district. "You know, Mrs. Henderson," he said during a pause in the conversation, "one of the reasons I chose this neighborhood was its strong community spirit. I heard about how everyone comes together for the annual block party, and how neighbors look out for each other." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Yes, well, we do try to maintain certain standards." "Exactly," the chief nodded, "standards of safety, mutual respect, and community support. Those are values I've upheld throughout my career, and they're what I plan to strengthen further in this department." As they talked, other neighbors began to emerge from their homes, curiosity finally overcoming their hesitation. The Patels from across the street were the first to approach, carrying a plate of freshly baked samosas. Soon after, the Rodriguezes arrived with their famous homemade empanadas. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was transforming into an impromptu welcome gathering. The chief greeted each neighbor warmly, learning names and sharing his vision for community policing. Even Mrs. Henderson found herself gradually relaxing as she watched him interact with everyone, his genuine warmth and professionalism impossible to ignore. The conversation naturally turned to neighborhood concerns. People spoke about speeding cars on Oak Street, teenagers gathering in the park after dark, and recent reports of package theft. The chief listened attentively, offering practical solutions and insights from his years of experience. "You know," he said, addressing the small crowd that had gathered, "true security isn't just about surveillance and reporting suspicious activity. It's about knowing your neighbors, understanding different perspectives, and working together to create a community where everyone feels safe and welcome." His words carried special weight as they watched Officer Chen efficiently taking notes, already turning neighbors' concerns into actionable items. This wasn't just talk, this was community policing in action. As the impromptu gathering continued, Mrs. Henderson found herself deep in conversation with Mrs. Patel about organizing a proper welcome party for the chief. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but the chief's graceful handling of the situation had given everyone a way to move forward positively. Later that evening, as neighbors began heading home, Mrs. Henderson lingered behind. The shame of her earlier actions still burned, but something else was growing alongside it, a grudging respect for the man she had so quickly judged. "Chief," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable. The chief looked at her thoughtfully. Mrs. Henderson, in my 20 years of service, I've learned that change happens one conversation at a time. What matters isn't where we start, but where we choose to go from there. As she walked back to her house, Mrs. Henderson noticed her neighborhood with new eyes. The street she had appointed herself to protect didn't need protection from change, it needed to embrace it. The chief's arrival wasn't a threat to their community standards, it was an opportunity to elevate them. Inside his new home, the chief began unpacking boxes, a small smile playing on his lips. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had confirmed what he'd hoped about this neighborhood. Beneath the surface tensions, there was a strong foundation of community spirit waiting to be nurtured. Officer Chen's final words before leaving echoed in his mind, "Chief, you've already started changing things around here." The chief knew that true change would take time, but tonight had been a promising start. As he hung his uniform for tomorrow, he felt more certain than ever that he'd made the right choice in moving to Oak Street. The next morning, the story of Mrs. Henderson's 911 call had spread through Oak Street like wildfire. The chief's response to the incident became the talk of the neighborhood, with residents sharing details over garden fences and in group chats. But unlike the usual neighborhood gossip, this story was sparking unexpected conversations about prejudice, community, and change. At the local coffee shop, where Mrs. Henderson usually held court with her friends every morning, she found herself uncharacteristically quiet. Her usual companions watched her with a mixture of curiosity and concern as she stirred her untouched coffee. "I just can't stop thinking about it," she finally admitted. "All these years, I thought I was protecting our neighborhood. But last night made me realize I was just..." She paused, struggling with the words, "I was just afraid of change." Meanwhile, the chief was already making his presence felt at the police department. During his first morning briefing, he shared his vision for community-oriented policing, using the previous night's events as a teaching moment without specifically calling out Mrs. Henderson. "Our job isn't just to respond to calls," he explained to the assembled officers. "It's to understand the community we serve. Sometimes, what looks like a security concern on the surface is actually an opportunity to build bridges." Word of his leadership style quickly spread through the department. Officers who had initially been skeptical of their new chief found themselves impressed by his balanced approach. He wasn't just talking about community policing, he was living it. Back on Oak Street, Mrs. Patel had taken the lead in organizing a proper welcome party for the chief. As she went door to door with invitations, she noticed something different in her neighbors' responses. People who had previously given her only polite nods were now inviting her in for tea, eager to discuss ideas for the gathering. The chief's teenage daughter, who had arrived later that week to join her father, brought another dimension to the neighborhood dynamics. A skilled basketball player, she soon had the previously empty court at the end of the street filled with local kids. The sound of bouncing balls and laughter replaced the suspicious silence that had once characterized the street. Mrs. Henderson watched these changes from her window seat, but her perspective had shifted. Instead of looking for threats, she found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before: the way Mrs. Rodriguez helped the elderly Mr. Thompson with his groceries, how the Patel children shared their cricket skills with other kids, and the natural way communities could blend and grow when given the chance. One afternoon, she spotted the chief's daughter shooting hoops alone. After a moment's hesitation, she walked over, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. The girl's initial wariness melted when Mrs. Henderson mentioned that she had been a basketball coach at the local middle school years ago. "Really?" The girl's eyes lit up. "Dad mentioned you were involved in the community, but he never said you were a coach." The chief, watching from his porch, smiled at the unexpected interaction. Later that evening, when Mrs. Henderson came to apologize again, he shared his perspective. "You know, most people think law enforcement is about maintaining the status quo," he said, offering her a seat. "But sometimes, it's about facilitating necessary changes." The best communities aren't frozen in time, they grow and adapt while keeping their core values intact. The conversation was interrupted by a call from the department. A situation needed the chief's attention, ironically, another neighbor dispute in a different part of town. Mrs. Henderson watched him leave, noting how he carried himself with the same calm authority he'd shown on that first night. The incident began to reshape the neighborhood in subtle but significant ways. The Neighborhood Watch Group, under Mrs. Henderson's surprisingly reformed leadership, shifted its focus from surveillance to community support. They organized meal trains for new parents, helped elderly residents with yard work, and created a program to check on neighbors during extreme weather. The chief's influence extended beyond Oak Street. His handling of the incident became a case study in de-escalation and community building at the police academy. Officer Chen, who had witnessed it firsthand, often shared the story with new recruits, emphasizing how good leadership could transform potential conflicts into opportunities for growth. As weeks passed, the neighborhood's reputation began to shift. Rather than being known as an exclusive enclave resistant to change, Oak Street became a model for community integration. Real estate agents started highlighting the area's strong community spirit and diverse, welcoming atmosphere in their listings. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some longtime residents still grumbled about changes to their quiet neighborhood. But the success of community initiatives, led by the unlikely partnership of the chief and Mrs. Henderson, was hard to ignore. 1 month after the incident, during the welcome party that had grown into a full-fledged community festival, Mrs. Henderson found herself sharing the story with newcomers. "I thought I was protecting our neighborhood's values," she would say, "but I had it all wrong. True community values aren't about keeping people out, they're about bringing people together." The chief, overhearing her words, nodded approvingly. His decision to handle that first night with grace rather than confrontation had set in motion changes that went far beyond a single incident or neighborhood. It was proof that sometimes, the most effective response to prejudice wasn't punishment but patience, not confrontation but conversation. 3 months after the infamous 911 call, Oak Street faced its first real test of change. The local council announced plans to build a community center on the vacant lot at the end of the street. The project, championed by the chief, quickly became a lightning rod for both progress and resistance in the neighborhood. At the first community meeting about the center, held in the high school gymnasium, old divisions threatened to resurface. Several longtime residents, including some of Mrs. Henderson's former allies, voiced concerns about increased traffic and maintaining the neighborhood's character, phrases that the chief recognized as coded language for deeper anxieties. The chief sat quietly through the initial complaints, carefully observing the room's dynamics. Mrs. Henderson, now seeing these situations through new eyes, felt increasingly uncomfortable as she recognized her old patterns of thinking in her neighbors' objections. Finally, she stood up, her hands shaking slightly but her voice steady. 3 months ago, I was the person most afraid of change on this street. I was the one talking about neighborhood character and maintaining standards. But I've learned something important since then. The room fell silent as she continued, what I thought I was protecting wasn't our neighborhood's character at all. I was protecting my own fears and prejudices. The real character of Oak Street isn't about excluding people, it's about growing together. The chief watched with pride as Mrs. Henderson shared her story, not sugarcoating her initial resistance but honestly describing her journey to understanding. Her words carried special weight because everyone knew where she had started. The proposed community center, the chief added, standing up after Mrs. Henderson finished, isn't just about having a new building. It's about creating a space where our children can learn from each other, where seniors can stay active, where families can gather regardless of which street they live on. He then unveiled detailed plans that addressed practical concerns while highlighting community benefits. The design included green spaces, a state-of-the-art security system, and programs that would serve residents of all ages. Most importantly, it would be staffed and run by local community members. Mrs. Patel's eldest son, an architect who had recently opened his own firm, volunteered to review the plans and suggest improvements that would blend the center's modern facilities with the neighborhood's traditional aesthetic. His involvement helped bridge the gap between preservation and progress. The Rodriguez family, who ran a successful landscaping business, offered to design and maintain the center's gardens as their contribution to the community. Their proposal incorporated plants from different cultural traditions, creating a living symbol of diversity and unity. As the meeting progressed, the conversation shifted from fears about change to excited discussions about possibilities. The same people who had initially opposed the center began offering suggestions for programs and activities. Someone proposed a community kitchen where residents could teach cooking classes sharing their cultural traditions. Another suggested a homework help program where retired teachers could tutor local students. The chief's daughter, who had become a beloved figure in the neighborhood, spoke about how the center's basketball court could host youth tournaments, bringing together kids from different parts of the city. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and soon other teenagers were volunteering ideas for youth programs. Mrs. Henderson found herself in the surprising position of mediating between different groups, using her deep knowledge of the neighborhood to help find compromises that everyone could accept. Her transformation from the neighborhood's self-appointed gatekeeper to one of its most effective bridge builders became a powerful example of how people could change. The chief's approach to the community center project reflected his larger philosophy about law enforcement and community relations. Instead of imposing changes from above, he created opportunities for residents to take ownership of the process. He understood that sustainable change had to come from within the community itself. One evening, as he and Mrs. Henderson reviewed program proposals for the center, she shook her head in amazement. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked. "That night when I called the police, you knew exactly what you were doing with that coffee invitation." The chief smiled. "I've learned that most people, when given the chance, want to do the right thing. Sometimes they just need someone to help them see a different way forward." The community center project became a catalyst for deeper changes in Oak Street. Residents who had lived as neighbors for years finally began to know each other as friends. The planning committees brought together people who might never have interacted otherwise, leading to unexpected collaborations and friendships. Even the local police department felt the impact. Officers assigned to the area began participating in community center planning sessions, building relationships with residents in non-enforcement situations. The chief's vision of community policing took tangible form as officers became known not just as law enforcement, but as community partners. As autumn approached and construction plans for the center were finalized, Oak Street had become almost unrecognizable from the tense, suspicious neighborhood of just a few months before. Yet in many ways, as the chief often pointed out, they had simply uncovered the best version of what had been there all along, a community of people capable of growth, understanding, and genuine connection. The transformation was perhaps best symbolized by the new sign designed for the community center. At Mrs. Henderson's suggestion, it would read, "Oak Street Community Center, Growing Together." The words perfectly captured both their journey and their aspirations, a reminder that the most important changes often start with a single moment of choosing understanding over fear. As winter approached and construction on the community center began, Oak Street faced an unexpected challenge. A local news station had gotten wind of the story about Mrs. Henderson's initial 911 call and the subsequent transformation of the neighborhood. They wanted to run a feature story about it, thrusting the quiet community into an uncomfortable spotlight. The chief received the media request one crisp morning at his office. His initial instinct was to decline. He had never sought recognition for his approach to community building. However, before making a decision, he decided to consult the people most affected by the story. That evening, he invited Mrs. Henderson, the Patels, the Rodriguezes, and several other key community members to his home for an informal discussion. His living room, now warmly decorated with family photos and community awards, had become a natural gathering place for neighborhood discussions. "I'm concerned about how media attention might affect our progress," Mrs. Henderson admitted, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "We've worked so hard to build trust. What if this stirs up old tensions?" Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Perhaps this is an opportunity. Think about other communities facing similar challenges. Our story might help them find a better way forward." The chief's daughter, doing homework in the corner, looked up. "At school, we've been studying how social change happens. Sometimes it takes one community showing what's possible to inspire others." The discussion continued late into the evening, weighing the risks and potential benefits. Finally, they reached a consensus: they would agree to the story, but with conditions. The entire community would participate in shaping the narrative, ensuring it focused not on past mistakes but on the journey toward positive change. When the news crew arrived the following week, they found a community prepared to share their story with remarkable candor and purpose. The reporter, expecting to find a simple tale of racial tension and resolution, discovered something far more nuanced. Mrs. Henderson chose to be interviewed at the construction site of the community center, surrounded by the physical evidence of change. She spoke honestly about her transformation, her voice steady even as she described her former prejudices. "The easiest thing would have been to remain set in my ways," she told the reporter. The chief could have responded with anger or punishment, and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he showed all of us, that real security comes from building connections, not walls. The news crew captured footage of daily life in the transformed Oak Street, the chief's daughter coaching younger kids in basketball, Mrs. Patel teaching a cooking class in her home, the Rodriguez children helping Mr. Thompson tend his prize-winning roses. These weren't staged events but genuine moments of community interaction that had become routine. Officer Chen, interviewed at the police station, shared how the Oak Street experience had influenced police training. "We now use this case as a model for community policing," he explained. "It's shown us that our most powerful tool isn't our authority, it's our ability to facilitate positive change." The story took an unexpected turn when other neighborhoods began reaching out. Community leaders from across the city wanted to learn more about Oak Street's transformation. The chief found himself fielding requests for presentations about community-oriented policing, while Mrs. Henderson was invited to speak at neighborhood association meetings about community building. However, the increased attention brought new challenges. Some residents worried about becoming a tourist attraction for progressive community planning. Others felt pressure to maintain an image of perfect harmony, even when natural disagreements arose. The chief addressed these concerns at a community meeting held in the partially constructed community center. Standing among exposed beams and unfinished walls, he reminded everyone that their strength lay not in perfection but in their commitment to growth. "What makes our community special isn't that we don't have problems," he said, his voice echoing in the unfinished space. "It's that we've learned to face them together. We're not a model of perfection, we're a model of possibility." Mrs. Henderson, now serving as the community center's volunteer coordinator, added her perspective. "Every time I walk past this construction site, I remember that night I called the police. But now, instead of feeling shame, I feel hope. Because this building represents what can happen when we choose to tear down the walls in our minds and hearts." The news story, when it finally aired, captured this spirit perfectly. Instead of sensationalizing the initial incident, it focused on the daily work of building community. The reporter highlighted how simple actions, a shared meal, a youth basketball game, a community garden, had gradually replaced suspicion with connection. The impact rippled beyond Oak Street. Other police departments began incorporating elements of the chief's approach into their community relations programs. Neighborhood associations reached out for advice on building inclusive communities. Local schools requested workshops on breaking down prejudices and building understanding. One particularly moving moment came when a group of students from the local high school created a documentary inspired by Oak Street's story. They interviewed residents about their experiences, capturing the honest struggles and genuine triumphs of community transformation. As spring approached and the community center neared completion, Oak Street had become something none of its residents had initially imagined, a living laboratory for positive change. The chief's original response to that 911 call had set in motion a series of changes that continued to evolve and grow. "You know what amazes me most?" Mrs. Henderson remarked one evening, as she and the chief watched the sunset from his porch. "It's not just that we changed. It's that we're still changing. Every day, we're discovering new ways to be better neighbors, better community members, better people." The day of the community center's grand opening arrived with an unexpected challenge. A small group of protesters from outside the neighborhood had gathered near the entrance, holding signs criticizing the gentrification of the area. They had seen the news coverage and decided that Oak Street's transformation deserved their scrutiny. The chief watched from his office window as Mrs. Henderson paced nervously on her front porch, phone in hand. She had already called him twice that morning, worried that the protesters would disrupt the celebration they had spent months planning. The opening ceremony was scheduled to begin in just a few hours. Instead of calling for police intervention, the chief decided to handle this situation the same way he had approached that first night on Oak Street, with dialogue and understanding. He drove home, changed into casual clothes, and walked to where the protesters had gathered. "I'm the police chief here, but today I'm just a resident of Oak Street," he said, approaching the group with open hands. "Would you be willing to share your concerns with me? Maybe over some coffee at our local cafe?" The protest leader, a young community activist, was initially skeptical but agreed. As they walked to the cafe, joined by Mrs. Henderson who had hurried over, an unexpected conversation began to unfold. "We've seen too many neighborhoods change in ways that push people out," the activist explained. "Your story got attention, but we're worried it's just sugarcoating displacement." Mrs. Henderson, who might once have responded defensively, listened carefully. "You know," she said, 6 months ago, I was the one resistant to change, but for different reasons. Would you be interested in hearing about what really happened here?" Over the next hour, residents began dropping by the cafe, adding their voices to the conversation. The Patels brought samosas from their restaurant. The Rodriguez family shared photos of their children's art classes that would be held in the new center. Current and future programs were discussed, with emphasis on how they would serve everyone in the broader community. "The center isn't about changing who lives here," the chief explained. "It's about creating space for everyone to belong." Every decision, from pricing structure to program selection, was made with input from residents across the economic spectrum. The protesters listened as community members shared their plans for free after-school programs, senior citizen activities, job training workshops, and culturally diverse events. They heard about the sliding scale fee system designed to ensure accessibility, and the community garden where families could grow fresh food. As the morning progressed, the tension began to dissolve. The activist group, seeing the genuine community involvement and careful planning that had gone into the center, began to ask different questions, not about what might be lost, but about what could be learned from Oak Street's approach. By the time the opening ceremony was set to begin, the protesters had put away their signs. Instead, they accepted invitations to join the celebration, their critical perspective adding valuable insights to ongoing discussions about keeping the center truly accessible and inclusive. The ceremony itself became a perfect demonstration of the community's growth. The chief's daughter and her basketball team performed a demonstration game on the new court. Mrs. Henderson, standing at the podium with trembling hands, spoke about transformation, both personal and communal. "This center represents more than just a building," she said, looking out at the diverse crowd. "It represents our commitment to growing together." Every brick was laid with the understanding that true community is built on acceptance, not exclusion. The protest leader was invited to speak as well, offering a perspective that reminded everyone of their responsibility to remain vigilant about genuine inclusion. The chief nodded approvingly. Real community strength came from embracing different viewpoints, not silencing them. As the day continued, the center came alive with activity. Children explored the new playground while seniors gathered in the community room for a bridge tournament. The teaching kitchen hosted its first cooking class, led by Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Rodriguez working together to create fusion recipes that represented their shared community. Officer Chen, who had been promoted to Community Relations Lieutenant, led tours of the center's innovative security features. "This is what modern policing looks like," he explained. Security systems designed with community input, transparency, and trust building in mind. The protest leader and several group members stayed for the entire day, engaging in conversations with residents and even signing up to volunteer for future programs. Their initial criticism had led to meaningful dialogue about maintaining affordability and accessibility, concerns that strengthened rather than weakened the center's mission. Late that evening, as the celebration wound down, the chief found Mrs. Henderson sitting quietly in the center's garden. "Quite a different outcome from what we feared this morning," he said, joining her on the bench. She smiled, watching the last families heading home through the twilight. "You know what made the difference? We actually listened to them. Just like you listened to me that first night, instead of just reacting." The protesters' concerns had actually helped the community strengthen their commitment to genuine inclusion. New ideas were already being discussed: a community fund to help lower-income families participate in programs, partnerships with local nonprofits, and regular town halls to ensure the center remained responsive to community needs. "Sometimes the strongest challenges to our progress," the chief reflected, "end up making that progress more meaningful. Every voice that questions us is an opportunity to examine our intentions and strengthen our commitment." As they locked up the center for the night, they could see lights on in homes all along Oak Street, where residents were still celebrating in small groups, sharing meals and stories. The community's journey hadn't ended; in many ways, it was just beginning. But they had learned that with open hearts and willing minds, even the most unexpected challenges could become opportunities for growth. 1 year after that fateful 911 call, Oak Street had become almost unrecognizable, not in its physical appearance, but in its spirit. The community center hummed with daily activity, becoming the beating heart of neighborhood life. However, success brought its own set of challenges, testing the community's commitment to inclusive growth. On a busy Wednesday afternoon, the chief sat in his office reviewing a concerning email. The center's popularity had exceeded all expectations, with programs filling up almost instantly. Some residents from surrounding neighborhoods had complained about being waitlisted, suggesting that Oak Street was becoming as exclusive as it had once been, just in a different way. He decided to bring the issue to the community board's weekly meeting, where Mrs. Henderson now served as vice chair. The board had become a model of diversity, reflecting the neighborhood's evolution. But today's discussion would test their problem-solving abilities. "We're victims of our own success," Mrs. Henderson explained to the packed meeting room. "Our programs are so popular that we're having to turn people away. The question is, how do we grow without losing what makes this place special?" The discussion that followed demonstrated how far the community had come. Instead of defensive reactions, residents offered thoughtful solutions. The Patel's eldest son, the architect who had helped design the center, presented preliminary plans for expanding the facility. The Rodriguez family suggested creating satellite programs in neighboring community spaces. But it was a newcomer's suggestion that really captured everyone's attention. A young teacher who had recently moved to Oak Street proposed creating a mentorship program. Experienced program participants could help launch similar initiatives in other neighborhoods, spreading the Oak Street model while maintaining its intimate community feel. The chief watched the discussion with pride. A year ago, he reflected aloud, we were worried about protecting our neighborhood from change. Now we're talking about how to share our success with others. That's real growth. The meeting sparked a new phase in Oak Street's evolution. The community center began hosting monthly workshops for other neighborhoods interested in developing similar programs. Mrs. Henderson, once the neighborhood's self-appointed gatekeeper, now traveled to community meetings across the city, sharing her story of transformation. The impact on local law enforcement was equally profound. The department's community policing program, inspired by the chief's handling of that initial incident, had reduced tension and improved cooperation throughout the city. Other police departments sent officers to observe and learn from their approach. One particularly touching moment came when a group of high school students created a documentary about Oak Street's transformation. They interviewed Mrs. Henderson and the chief, capturing the honesty of their unlikely friendship and its impact on the community. Looking back, Mrs. Henderson said in her interview, "I realize I was policing my neighborhood the wrong way. I thought safety meant keeping people out. The chief showed us that real safety comes from letting people in, into our community, into our lives, into our hearts." The documentary also captured the daily life of the community center, seniors teaching teenagers to play chess, children from different backgrounds becoming best friends, families sharing cultural traditions through cooking classes. These simple interactions had become the foundation of their strong community bonds. However, not everything was perfect. The center faced practical challenges, maintaining funding, managing growth, balancing diverse needs. Some programs had growing pains, and occasionally, old prejudices would surface in subtle ways. One incident involved an elderly resident complaining about too much noise from the center's youth programs. The complaint could have reopened old wounds, but the community's response showed their growth. Instead of becoming defensive, they invited the resident to help design activities that would bridge the generation gap. The chief's daughter, now heading to college, had become a symbol of the community's transformation. Her basketball program had grown into a citywide youth league that brought together kids from different neighborhoods. At her graduation party, held at the community center, she announced her plans to study urban planning and community development. "This neighborhood taught me what's possible when people choose understanding over fear," she said in her speech. "I want to help other communities make that same choice." As summer approached, Oak Street prepared for its biggest challenge yet, hosting the city's first Community Integration Summit. Representatives from neighborhoods across the city would come to learn from their experience. The pressure to present a perfect image was strong, but the chief had different ideas. "We're not going to show them a sanitized version of our story," he told the planning committee. "We'll share the real journey, the mistakes, the struggles, and the ongoing work. That's what will truly help other communities." Mrs. Henderson nodded in agreement. "Our strength isn't in being perfect. It's in being willing to learn and grow together." The summit preparation brought new energy to Oak Street. Residents opened their homes for workshop sessions, sharing not just their successes but their challenges and learning moments. The community center became a living laboratory of positive change. One evening, as the chief and Mrs. Henderson walked through the center after a planning meeting, they paused to watch a group of children playing basketball. The kids represented every part of their diverse community, playing together as if it had always been this way. "Sometimes I wonder," Mrs. Henderson mused, "what would have happened if I hadn't made that 911 call that night?" The chief smiled. "Everything happens for a reason. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important growth, if we're willing to learn from them." As they stood there, watching the next generation of Oak Street grow up together, they could see their community's future taking shape. The journey that had begun with a prejudiced phone call had transformed not just a neighborhood, but countless lives. And they were still growing, still learning, still showing others what was possible when fear gave way to understanding. 2 years had passed since that transformative night when Mrs. Henderson made the 911 call that changed everything. The Community Integration Summit was in full swing, and Oak Street had become a beacon of hope for other neighborhoods struggling with change. But it was a quiet moment in the midst of all this activity that brought the journey full circle. The chief stood at his office window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. On his desk lay a letter, his nomination for the National Community Policing Excellence Award. The nomination hadn't come from his department or city officials, but from Mrs. Henderson herself. As he read through her words describing that first night and everything that followed, his phone buzzed with a message. A colleague from another city was asking for advice about a situation eerily similar to what Oak Street had faced 2 years ago, a resident calling the police on a new neighbor based on prejudice. Before responding, the chief decided to take a walk through his neighborhood. The streets were alive with summit activities. Workshop participants from different cities moved between houses and the community center, engaged in deep discussions about community building and positive change. He passed the basketball court where his daughter had first brought neighborhood kids together. Now, a new generation of young players practiced under the guidance of local teens who had been part of her original program. They played beneath a recently completed mural that depicted Oak Street's journey, painted collaboratively by residents of all ages. At the community center, he found Mrs. Henderson giving a tour to visiting community leaders. She had become known for her candid way of sharing their story, never shying away from acknowledging her own past mistakes while emphasizing the power of transformation. The hardest part, she was telling the group, isn't admitting you were wrong. It's doing the daily work of being better. Every day, we have to choose understanding over fear, connection over division. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. The chief waited until the tour ended before approaching her. I received your nomination letter, he said quietly. Mrs. Henderson smiled, but her eyes were serious. You know, I've been thinking about legacy lately. Not just ours, but what we're passing on to the next generation. Yesterday, I overheard my grandson explaining to his friend why we don't judge people based on how they look. He's 7 years old, but he gets it. That's real change. Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the center's main hall. The Patel and Rodriguez families were leading a joint cooking demonstration, teaching summit participants how their collaborative cooking classes had helped bridge cultural divides in the community. The aroma of blending spices and traditions filled the air as visitors learned about more than just cooking. They were seeing firsthand how simple activities could break down barriers and build understanding. Later that evening, the summit's keynote session featured a panel of Oak Street residents sharing their experiences. The chief noticed something remarkable as he listened: every story, while unique, carried the same thread of transformation. It wasn't just Mrs. Henderson who had changed, the entire community had undergone a profound shift in perspective. A visiting police chief asked about handling resistance to change. The chief's response reflected 2 years of learned wisdom: change doesn't have to be confrontational. Sometimes the strongest response to prejudice is patience, understanding, and creating opportunities for people to choose a better way forward. After the session, Mrs. Henderson hosted a dinner at her house for summit participants. Her home, once a fortress of surveillance, had become a gathering place for community celebration. Photos of neighborhood events covered her walls, replacing her old neighborhood watch certificates. Over dinner, stories flowed freely. Visitors shared their own community challenges, while Oak Street residents offered insights from their experience. The conversation wasn't about perfect solutions but about the ongoing work of building inclusive communities. The chief's daughter, home from college for the summit, shared how their experience had influenced her studies in urban planning. Other students talk about community building in theory, she said. I can talk about it in practice, because I've lived it. I've seen how one moment of choosing understanding over fear can transform an entire neighborhood. As the evening wound down, the chief and Mrs. Henderson found themselves back on his porch, much like that first night 2 years ago. But now, instead of tension and uncertainty, there was a deep appreciation for how far they'd come. You never did tell me, Mrs. Henderson said, why you responded the way you did that night. You could have handled it so differently. The chief was quiet for a moment before responding. In 25 years of law enforcement, I've learned that most people want to do the right thing. Sometimes they just need someone to show them there's a better way. That night, I saw an opportunity not just to handle an incident, but to transform a community. As if to punctuate his words, they heard laughter from the community center, where a group of summit participants had gathered for an evening basketball game. The players represented different cities, backgrounds, and cultures, but on the court, they were just neighbors sharing a game. The next morning, as summit participants prepared to return to their own communities, the chief received another message. The colleague who had asked for advice about a similar situation reported back. They had tried the Oak Street approach, inviting dialogue instead of confrontation. The initial results were promising. Mrs. Henderson, hearing this news during their morning coffee meeting, smiled. "You know what this means? That night when I made the worst mistake of my life, it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning." The chief nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. Their story had become more than just a local success, it was a template for possibility, showing other communities that change, while challenging, was always possible. As they watched the summit participants depart, carrying Oak Street's lessons back to their own neighborhoods, they realized their journey had come full circle. What had begun as a moment of prejudice had transformed into a movement of understanding, rippling out far beyond their small street. The community they had built wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a living example of what could happen when people chose connection over division, understanding over fear, and growth over stagnation. Most importantly, it was proof that even the darkest moments could become catalysts for positive change, if people were willing to open their hearts and minds to new possibilities.